All right, so we have talked about population ecology and how population sizes increase and decrease and shift and change based upon a whole variety of different factors. We then carried that information over into community ecology, where we looked at how all the populations in a given area interact with each other: predator, prey, parasitism, mutualism, etc. And the big concept to remember is as you influence one population, it has a rippling effect to all the other populations within that community. If your predator population goes up, it causes problems with prey, and then there's just so many interactions there. Well, what we want to look at now are some of the different dynamics that exist within ecosystems. So we're broadening our scope. We're looking at the bigger picture. So we're taking into consideration individuals, populations, communities, and now looking at the ecosystem level. So how do the abiotic factors impact and influence the living things within a community or an ecosystem? And then how do the living things influence the abiotics? So all of you who have fish tanks, think about that as a little ecosystem. And if you do something to the water or the temperature or the light levels or etc., how does that impact the fish and snails and things in your tank? And then vice versa, if you have too many fish or a fish dies, what does that do to the water quality in the tank? That's the idea behind the dynamics of ecosystems. We're now going to explore how the abiotic, which means non-living, and the biotic, which means living, interact and influence each other. All right, so when we look at this, what we look at are some nutrient cycles, cycling of different nutrients or elements throughout ecosystems. There are a whole bunch out there. I want us just to focus on a couple of the key primary ones. The first one to discuss here will be the carbon cycle. All right, so think about carbon as an element. You got your big C, you got your atomic mass, your atomic number, carbon bonds to all sorts of other things, and creates all sorts of stuff. Carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, all sorts of different bicarbonate ions, etc. So what we're going to see when we look at an ecosystem, the producers within the ecosystem will capture and store carbon. Now, when I use the term producer, I want you guys to remember anything running photosynthesis qualifies as a producer. So that includes all of those algae we've discussed. Think about all the protists. Those are all producers. Anybody who runs photosynthesis. So obviously your plants, your land plants, your vascular plants, non-vascular plants, your seedless, your flowering, etc. But also the plankton. Lots of the plankton load in the protist content. You got your diatoms, you have all of your different algae, brown algae, golden algae, red algae, green algae, euglenas, etc. They're all producers. So they will capture and store the carbon and change it. Usually they change it into carbohydrates, glucose. So let's put that back up there. C6H12O6. Kind of the oh, I lost my O6. Apologize for not doing super or subscripts here. But glucose, that's generally how they're going to be storing their carbon in that form. All right, or they convert it into whatever product they need. So that's basic photosynthesis. You guys should all have that under your belts. But then the consumers typically run cellular respiration and release carbon. Okay, so think about aerobic respiration, and we do want to pay attention to anaerobic respiration. So as we're sitting here exhaling, we're giving off CO2. Your body is breaking down the nutrients that you ate for lunch or dinner or breakfast or whatever you ate or drank and converting that into carbon dioxide. The other big thing to mention is the combustion of fossil fuels also releases carbon. So when we burn coal and oil and natural gases, we are breaking apart stored carbon and releasing it into the atmosphere. This is one of the big contributing factors of climate change. Okay, so if you take a look at the diagram, kind of get the feel for how carbon moves throughout an ecosystem, nature wants to keep in balance and maintain harmony. The problem is when we increase in one area or decrease too much in another area, that can disrupt the ecological balance. That is what we have done because of the massive combustion of fossil fuels and the reduction in the number of producers because of habitat destruction. And this is why we are seeing climate change. All right, so the carbon cycle is just the first cycle to mention. Next one that, some people would almost argue is more important or the most important is the hydrological cycle. They're all important, but everything in the big picture, everything kind of connects into the hydrological cycle. So a couple things to mention here, or a big concept to mention. The amount of water on the earth is stable. It is not changing. We are not adding water to the planet. We're not losing water. It's stable. The volume of water is not going to change. What is changing is the type, meaning freshwater, saltwater, etc., and the quality is changing. Unfortunately, the quality of water is decreasing on our planet because of us, because of human interaction, because of things we're doing like with the carbon cycle. That excess carbon goes into the atmosphere, gets captured into clouds, we get other pollutants being produced. Now you have acidic rain that comes down, or we should say acidic precipitation, that comes down to the earth, that starts changing ecosystems, etc. But everything is connected to the hydrological cycle. I want you to think about the hydrological cycle like the circulatory system in the human body. You inject a drug anywhere into your bloodstream, and it will go through your whole body because it's a loop. So is a hydrological cycle on Earth. So we dump oil or pollutants or pesticides or herbicides or whatever anywhere in this cycle, and eventually it will come back to all of us. So let's say, oh, I contaminated my fields here. I sprayed a pesticide. Well, now it's in your well water. Maybe it winds up in the ocean. Or we had an oil slick in the ocean. Some of that doesn't biodegrade, gets picked up into the environment, comes up into the atmosphere. It doesn't go away unless we have natural processes. Different things in nature will detoxify. The problem is we've overloaded those poor organisms and they can't keep up. Okay, so there's always been pollutants on the earth. The thing is, nature has always been balanced enough to detoxify those things. I mean, there's bacteria that will break down pollutants. We just are throwing so much at them they can't keep up. And that's changing the quality and the type of water. As climate change occurs, we have less frozen water. That means there's more fresh water or more salt water, because as those polar caps melt, the ocean levels are rising. It is happening. It's in front of us, people. So again, a lot of these ideas, the bigger picture is what we go into more in depth in environmental science courses. So the environmental science course, we get a lot more detailed on these topics. for what we're doing, this is just kind of an overview. All right, next cycle to talk about briefly is the nitrogen cycle. The movement of nitrogen through an ecosystem. Oh. All right, so the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is often a limiting nutrient for many producers. Producers need nitrogen. So think about your typical plant. Nitrogen is an important element for it. If it doesn't get enough, it doesn't grow, it doesn't develop, it doesn't produce as much. So it limits the productivity. Generally, the availability, oh, gotta spell that right. OAVA. The availability of nitrogen depends on microbes. A lot of bacteria play a role in the nitrogen cycle. So let's go all the way back to the beginning of the semester when we talked about legumes and root nodules, nitrogen producing bacteria. They can take nitrogen in one form, convert it, change it, and make it available to the plant. Awesome relationship to talk about. You lose those microbes, your plants lose their ability to get as much nitrogen, and that limits their productivity. Decomposition helps break down nitrogen and release it into the soil. So all these things cycle together within an ecosystem. Okay, the last cycle to mention is phosphorus. Phosphorus is also a limiting nutrient for producers. So it kind of runs parallel to nitrogen. When we look at phosphorus, it again is primarily available through decomposition and weathering of rock. All right, so it's primarily available weathering of rocks and minerals. That's how phosphorus primarily comes into an ecosystem, unless humans bring it into the ecosystem, hence fertilizer. So if you look at fertilizer, a lot of phosphate, a lot of nitrogen. It's great for plant growth. The problem is we dump fertilizers on a field, we get a big heavy spring rain, fertilizer winds up in your pond. And then the producer base in your pond, those things we call algae, go, hey, thank you for that $10,000 worth of fertilizer that just washed off into the pond. We're going to have a massive algae bloom. As this accumulates towards the Mississippi River and dumps into the Gulf of Mexico, it creates a massive algae bloom. So remember those red tide events? This is all talking about that. This is putting the puzzle together. What causes a red tide event? Excess nitrogen and phosphorus entering the aquatic ecosystem. Locally on small scale, we call it eutrophication. So one of the pictures from the Padlet wall had, somebody said moss. That's not moss growing on that pond. It's algae. Come on, you guys are bio majors. Algae. That algae is exploding in the spring because of the runoff from the fields. The excess nitrogen and phosphorus that washes into those fields. Okay, so again, I want you guys, let's start putting the picture together. Let's take all those different groups we've discussed, all those relationships we've discussed, and now let's put it together. This is where, again, depending on your interest in biology, and even if you're an ecologist, your area of ecology interest, this is where it gets fun because we're going to start looking at lots and lots of connections and how all these things tie together. All right, so part 2, we're going to start talking about what's called trophic levels and where these organisms fit within the food chain. So predator-prey becomes a really important part of the next piece of information we'll discuss.